This episode I'm going to be talking about body image and more specifically my relationship with food and my experiences both good and bad with body image. Growing up, as a kid I was not particularly big. I was a little bit chubby, but like kid weight. However, sort of as it got more towards high school age, I became pretty fat. And that's something that once it started, it kind of just continued. I think I was probably average size when I was around 12 or 13, and then going sort of 13 to 14, 15, I was getting bigger and bigger. Incidentally, 14 is sort of the peak of my depression, and my body image was certainly something that had a role in how I felt about myself at that time. I think at my biggest as a teenager, I was wearing a size 40 waist. It kind of snowballed to the point that I felt so uncomfortable that I didn't want to get changed in the changing room for PE, so I just didn't do PE. Then, of course, I'm not getting any exercise, and I'd actually just spend my PE lesson kind of eating, sometimes even drinking. And that obviously had a huge knock on my confidence, as well as having come out around the same time and not being in a very good headspace, being really depressed and other stuff that I spoke about in the previous video. It just kind of hit a point where it felt like there was never going to be a return from it, and I was just always going to be massive. And I was at a point, I was huge. It wasn't one of those things where it was like, oh, he's put on a bit of weight and you kind of keep it to yourself. Like I was the fat gay kid. And that's sort of, when you hit a certain point, you end up in a bit of a vicious cycle with food. You might try and lose some weight and not really see any results, so you'll get upset, so you'll comfort eat, and then you'll put on more weight, and it will just keep going round and round and round until you're like looking in the mirror, how did I get to this size? How am I wearing a size 40? How am I wearing double XLs? Of course, when I got to university and the drinking is a lot more frequent, that adds more to it. Drinking pretty much every day and eating shit every day, and your body's a mess, so you're just sleeping all the time, but you're not out drinking. And it just really catches up with me and really caught up with me. It very much affected the way I saw myself as a whole, not just physically, because I was someone who couldn't look after myself. And I thought, well, no one's going to want to be with someone that can't look after themselves either. So then that gets in your head, back to the fridge. A bit later into my 20s, I think I just was a bit more aware of the health repercussions of the way I was living and such. And I did try getting more into exercise and for a bit, and I did lose a bit of weight, but then I realized a different cycle was happening in that I would lose a bit of weight, and so I could be like, yes, that's awesome. So once I treated myself for having lost a bit of weight, I treat myself again and again and again and again until everything I'd lost was back, and then I was back at square one, and then I was feeling down about the way I looked, and then I was eating loads again. There were times when I just was so frustrated with myself. I found it easier to just eat nothing, to just not eat for days, than I did to adapt my lifestyle. There was a time in my mid-20s, I think I probably didn't eat anything for like 7 or 8 days, but I was still drinking, so I wasn't actually losing any weight. I was just feeling sick as shit, and damaging my body even further. it wasn't really until probably till I moved to New Zealand, and started getting my head together, that I was really prepared to do the actual work that it took to look after yourself physically. In September 2016, I went over to Perth, where I used to live, for a friend's wedding, and quite a few people had sort of passed comment that I'd lost a bunch of weight, and I, as far as I was concerned, I wasn't aware that I had, especially when you've never particularly been happy with what you've seen in the mirror. For people to tell you that you're looking good, it feels great. I will say you should not change your physical self for someone else. It's got to be for you, otherwise you won't stick. But I did start doing it for me because I liked that buzz. So I joined this health program that a friend of mine created, and I lost a hell of a lot of weight in a very short period of time. I went from, I think, beginning, maybe mid 2016, I was at one of my heaviest. I was like 115 kg or something like that, and by New Year I was 83. I was like a 30 kg drop very quickly. And this program has done really good for a bunch of people. I know a lot of people still do it, and it's really become a huge part of their lifestyle. But for me, it was a good quick fix. I lost the weight I wanted to, and I felt really good and confident in myself. I found it quite restrictive, and so I went traveling for 3 months after I'd sort of finished this program, and just kind of enjoyed myself, as you do when you're traveling. After 3 months of backpacking around Europe and then going to Vegas, you're not going to be in great shape anyway. But I came back, and I'd put on about 8 kg, which took me back up to like 90.5. Still a lot lighter than I'd been for my entire life. But I had a real big case of the post-travel blues. Just found myself very quickly falling back into old habits, being out all the time, not looking after myself, never going to the gym. And whilst I didn't start putting on loads of weight, I started feeling physically absolutely wank. Now, for me, I find that my food intake has a real impact on my mental health. If I'm just constantly eating crap, regardless of whether I'm having physical changes or not, I start feeling miserable. I start getting a bit inside my own head and not really being very motivated, and that for me was why it was more important to keep an eye on my food intake and my relationship with food, because I think physical and mental health do very often come hand in hand, and it's a lot harder to look after your physical self if you're in poor mental health, particularly if you're someone who didn't have a lot of self-worth. You don't see the point in looking after yourself. So I had to really begin to understand my own relationship with food and my trigger points. Thankfully, that's something I've managed to do. I am very aware of my behavioral patterns. I can see certainly when I'm starting to do things that I used to do in the past, and not just as a one-off. When I'm starting to frequently do them, it's time to sort of take a step back and look at myself and be like, cool, what's actually going on here? What changes need to be made for you to get back on track? And eventually I pretty much nailed it, and I made a few people aware of what my triggers were, or my red flags, I guess, because as much as I have become pretty in tune with myself mentally, you don't always recognize your symptoms straight away, and sometimes you recognize them when you're maybe a bit too deep into a storm